The weight of unseen air. The silence of Blackwood Manor was not merely an absence of sound, it was a presence thick and suffocating, like a shroud woven from ancient dust and forgotten breath. It clung to Elias Thorne the moment he stepped across the threshold, a silence so profound it seemed to press against his eardrums, filling the void where the city's cacophony had once resided. He had sought refuge here, in this crumbling edifice nestled deep within the Catskills, hoping its isolation would mend the ragged edges of his grief, a quiet balm for a soul worn thin by loss. Instead, the house offered only a different kind of wound, slow and insidious. Elias, a man whose life had been meticulously catalogued in academic journals and obscure literary critiques, found himself adrift in a sea of his own making. The inheritance, willed to him by a distant, forgotten aunt, was less a gift and more a penance. Blackwood Manor stood as a monument to faded grandeur and relentless entropy. Its slate roof sagged like a weary spine, and the once proud Victorian trim was now a skeletal filigree of rot and peeling paint. Twisted, ancient oaks, their branches gnarled like arthritic fingers, clawed at the sky, casting long, predatory shadows that bled into the house's already perpetual gloom. A perpetual twilight seemed to cling to the property, even on the brightest days, as if the very light recoiled from its oppressive aura. Inside, the air itself tasted of history and neglect, a dry, metallic tang mingled with the sweeter, more insidious scent of decay and damp earth. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that managed to pierce the grime-caked windows, miniature galaxies swirling in a static universe. The vast, echoing hall, with its grand, bifurcated staircase ascending into shadow, felt less like an entrance and more like a maw. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes following him with unsettling precision, lined the walls, their gazes like cold touches on his skin. Each piece of furniture, shrouded in heavy white dust sheets, looked like a ghost, waiting to shed its spectral covering and reveal something terrible beneath. For the first few days, Elias attributed the constant shivers running down his spine to the manor's pervasive chill, a coldness that seeped into his bones, regardless of the fire he stoked in the great hearth. He spent his time exploring, mapping the labyrinthine corridors of the ground floor, cataloging the dusty volumes in the sprawling library, and setting up his makeshift study in a sunnier, or at least less oppressive room, overlooking the overgrown garden. He yearned for the simple rhythm of work, the solace of words on a page, hoping to anchor himself in the familiar amid the alien grandeur. It began subtly, an almost imperceptible discordant note in the symphony of silence. He was in the library, a vast chamber lined with towering mahogany shelves, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and leather. He'd been trying to reshelve a particularly heavy tome on esoteric rituals when a smaller, lighter volume, a slim collection of forgotten poetry, seemed to shift on the shelf above it. It didn't fall, not exactly. It merely tilted ever so slightly, as if nudged by an unseen hand. Elias paused, his brow furrowed. He'd been careful. The shelf was sturdy. He reached up, pushed the book back into place, and dismissed it as the settling of old wood, a trick of his weary eyes. He hadn't slept well since arriving. The silence, he found, was unexpectedly loud. Later that evening, as dusk bled across the sky, painting the grimy window panes in shades of bruised purple and gray, Elias found himself in the drawing room, attempting to clear away some of the dust sheets. He paused, his gaze drawn to the grand fireplace, its mantelpiece adorned with an array of antique curios. He felt a fleeting impression, a flicker at the very edge of his vision, a shadow, darker than the deepening twilight outside, detaching itself from the wall beside the hearth and sliding silently across the polished wooden floor. It was gone before he could fully register it, a phantom stain on his peripheral sight. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. Exhaustion, he told himself, the flickering light from his single lamp playing tricks. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the house was getting to him. Sleep, when it came, was fitful, punctuated by the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the manor. The house seemed to breathe around him, a living, groaning entity settling into its ancient slumber. One night, a distinct sound pierced through his dream-hazed consciousness, a soft, rhythmic thump-thump. It wasn't loud, but it was insistent. He lay still, heart quickening, listening. It seemed to come from upstairs, directly above his bedroom. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy. His breath hitched. He was alone in the house. He knew this with an absolute certainty. No caretaker, no curious villagers, just Elias. He forced himself to rationalize. The old plumbing, perhaps? A tree branch brushing against the roof? The house settling, as old houses do. He waited, straining his ears, but the sound faded, replaced by the omnipresent silence, now charged with a new, unsettling tension. He pulled the thick, musty duvet higher, the linen feeling suddenly inadequate. The strange occurrences, once dismissible, began to accrue, each one a tiny chip in the veneer of his rational mind. The chill, for instance. It was no longer merely the general coldness of the house. It became localized, specific. He would be engrossed in a book in the library, a fire crackling merrily in the hearth, when a sudden icy breath would brush against the back of his neck, raising gooseflesh. It was not a draft. The air around him remained still, stagnant. It was a focused cold, a transient pocket of Arctic air that would linger for a moment, prickling his skin, before dissipating as quickly as it appeared. He would spin around, convinced someone was standing behind him, only to find the empty space mocking his paranoia. He started developing rituals. Before bed, he would check all the doors and windows on the ground floor, ensuring they were latched. He'd inspect the locks, convince himself no one could possibly have entered. Yet, the subtle shifts continued. A small porcelain bird figurine on the mantelpiece in the dining room, a gift from his aunt, would be found facing a different direction each morning, its painted eyes seemingly fixed on the doorway. Elias would pick it up, his fingers trembling slightly, and return it to its original position, convinced he was merely forgetful, disoriented by the vastness of the house. He started taking photographs of its placement just to prove his own sanity. The next morning, it would be turned again. The shadows grew bolder, no longer mere flickers in his periphery. They elongated, deepened. He would catch them in the corner of his eye, slithering across the floorboards of the long, unlit hallway, coalescing for a fraction of a second into something vaguely humanoid before dissolving into the pervasive gloom. He found himself turning lights on in rooms he knew he wouldn't enter for hours, just to banish the oppressive darkness. The electricity bills would be astronomical, he mused, but sanity had no price. One particularly oppressive afternoon, a heavy rainstorm lashed against the manor, transforming the already dim interiors into a watery, suffocating twilight. Elias was in the kitchen, attempting to brew a strong cup of tea, when the unmistakable sound of footsteps returned. This time they were clearer, more defined. Not directly above him, but seemingly coming from the floor below him, the old unused servants' quarters which he hadn't yet dared to explore. Thump, drag, thump, drag. It wasn't merely walking, it was the sound of something heavy, something with a deliberate, slow momentum, being pulled across the floor. A shiver, colder than any localized draft, snaked its way down his spine. His hand, holding the kettle, began to tremble. He listened, straining. The sound continued, slowly traversing what felt like the length of a room before stopping abruptly. The silence that followed was not the house's usual heavy quiet, it was a hungry, expectant silence. Elias stood frozen, tea forgotten, his heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He swallowed hard, the dryness in his throat unbearable. "Rationalize it," he commanded himself. "It's the storm, the wind, the old house settling." But the sound had been too distinct, too intentional. He pictured a sack, heavy and rough, being dragged, or a body. The thought bloomed in his mind, sickeningly vivid. He had to check. He knew he would regret it, but the alternative, living with the gnawing uncertainty, was worse. He grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from the utility drawer, its beam cutting a stark path through the rain-streaked gloom. His breath hitched in his throat as he moved towards the kitchen door, his gaze fixed on the darkened entryway that led to the basement stairs. Each step he took felt impossibly loud in the suddenly amplified silence of the house. The basement door was a thick slab of oak, warped with age, its iron handle cold beneath his clammy palm. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the latch. The air around him suddenly dropped several degrees, and the distinct, cloying scent of damp earth and something indefinable, something metallic, like old blood, filled his nostrils. He felt a sudden, profound sense of being watched. Not just observed, but scrutinized, analyzed. With a surge of adrenaline, he twisted the handle and pulled. The door groaned open, revealing a gaping maw of darkness. A steep, narrow staircase descended into an abyss of shadow, the air growing heavier, colder, with each step he imagined taking. He shone the flashlight down, the beam struggling to pierce the impenetrable blackness at the bottom. The stairs were slick with moisture, cobwebs clinging to the raw stone walls like tattered flags. Nothing. No movement, no further sound, just the oppressive silence of the deep. He stood there for a long moment, the flashlight beam trembling in his hand, his ears aching from the strain of listening. He could hear his own ragged breathing, the frantic beat of his heart. The dragging sound was gone. Had it been his imagination? The storm playing tricks on his frayed nerves? As he slowly began to withdraw, ready to pull the door shut and try to forget the whole terrifying incident, a sudden, piercing cold struck him. It was no mere draft, no localized chill. It felt like an invisible, icy hand clamping around his ear, and then, impossibly, a whisper. It was not a whisper of words, not truly. It was a sound like dry leaves skittering across a tombstone, like sand sifting through bone, yet undeniably close, right next to his ear, a breath of freezing air that carried no warmth, no life. It was too indistinct to form meaning, but its intent was clear. You are not alone. Elias stumbled back, slamming the basement door shut with a violent thud that echoed through the house. He leaned against it, chest heaving, his face slick with a cold sweat. His mind reeled. He had been so determined to rationalize, to dismiss, to cling to the scientific and the explainable. But this was beyond the scope of drafts and settling timbers. This was an undeniable presence, an unseen entity that had just breathed its icy secret into his very being. He retreated, not just from the door, but from the entire floor, scrambling back towards the relative safety of his study, the lamp's warm glow now feeling like a feeble, desperate defiance against the engulfing darkness. The house no longer felt like a sanctuary, nor even just a crumbling prison. It felt like a living thing, watching him, listening, its ancient heart beginning to stir with a malevolent awareness. He lay awake that night, staring into the gloom, every creak, every groan of the old manor now imbued with a terrifying significance. The silence was no longer empty, it was laden, heavy with a silent, waiting gaze.
He was no longer alone. He was merely observed. And the thought, like a shard of ice, pierced through the last vestiges of his composure. What did it want? The breath of the unseen, that chilling caress against his ear, had not only slammed shut the basement door, but had also sealed Elias's retreat into rational denial. The world, once a neat collection of explainable phenomena, had fractured, revealing an unsettling void beneath.
Sleep became a battleground, his mind replaying the phantom whisper, each syllable of the non-word carving deeper into his sanity. He would wake with a gasp, the taste of rust and old earth in his mouth, convinced a cold gaze was fixed upon him from the foot of his bed. The following days were a slow, agonizing descent. The sporadic incidents became a relentless siege. The manor, once merely ancient, now felt actively hostile, a conscious entity waking from a long, malevolent slumber. Elias no longer attributed the pervasive chill to old stones. It was a living cold, following him from room to room. He would feel it coalesce around him, a tightening band of frigid air, sometimes so intense it made his teeth ache, before receding as if satisfied with his discomfort. The books in the library were no longer merely shifting, they were flung. He was in his makeshift study, attempting to force himself into a semblance of normalcy by reading, when a resounding crash tore through the oppressive silence. He dropped his book, heart leaping into his throat, and bolted towards the library. There, scattered across the polished oak floorboards, lay a dozen heavy tomes, their pages splayed, spines cracked. They had been pulled, not fallen, from the highest shelves, far beyond his reach. A single leather-bound volume lay open in the center of the chaotic display, its brittle pages revealing a faded, hand-drawn illustration of a gnarled skeletal tree. A cold, dry breeze, smelling faintly of sulfur, brushed past him, though every window in the room was sealed. His attempts to barricade himself in his study proved futile. Doors, which he meticulously latched and even jammed with wedges, would be found ajar moments later, sometimes swinging wide with a low, mournful creak, sometimes merely a sliver open, a silent invitation to the darkness beyond. He started checking them constantly, a frantic, futile patrol against an invisible adversary. One evening, as he stood in the vast, empty dining room, contemplating the ghostly silhouettes of covered furniture, the heavy oak door leading to the kitchen slammed shut behind him with such force it rattled the antique china in the nearby cabinet. Elias jumped, a choked cry escaping his lips, spinning around to face the now closed door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound was deafening, final, and utterly without physical cause. He stood there, frozen, the echo of the impact reverberating in the suddenly deafening silence. The whispers intensified, no longer indistinct. They were still not full words, not yet, but fragments, insidious suggestions that clawed at the edges of his hearing. They would emerge from the shadows of the long hallway, a sibilant hiss that seemed to snake around his ankles. Or they would erupt from the very air beside his ear, a dry, raspy utterance that might have been his name, mangled and stretched into something grotesque. Os. A voice would rasp, a sound like gravel grinding against bone, making the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. He would spin, flashlight beam cutting frantically through the gloom, but always, only empty air. The objects dragging across the darkness returned, but with a horrifying new dimension. It was no longer confined to the basement. He was on the second floor, exploring the dusty, unused bedrooms, when he heard it. A rhythmic, scraping sound emanating from the master bedroom at the end of the hall, a room he had thus far avoided out of a superstitious dread. It was the sound of something heavy, something with sharp edges, being slowly, deliberately pulled across the bare floorboards. It sounded like furniture, or perhaps something even larger. He crept closer, flashlight held aloft, its beam dancing nervously ahead of him. The door to the master bedroom was ajar, a sliver of darkness framed by the ornate carved wood. The scraping continued, punctuated by heavy, guttural thuds. He pushed the door open, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The room was vast, dominated by a four-poster bed draped in what looked like centuries of dust. But it wasn't the bed that caught his eye. In the center of the room, a heavy antique wardrobe, one he knew for a fact was too massive for a single person to move, had been dragged several feet from its original position against the wall. Its dark wood gleamed faintly in the flashlight's beam, and a deep, gouged track marred the polished floor beneath it. And then he saw it. Perched on top of the wardrobe, almost casually, was the porcelain bird figurine from the dining room, its painted eyes seeming to stare directly at him, a silent, knowing witness. The air in the room was thick with a cloying metallic scent like stale blood and dust, and the temperature plummeted so sharply Elias could see his own breath misting in the air. He backed away slowly, his mind screaming in protest. This was beyond drafts, beyond settling. This was deliberate, malicious. The entity was strong, undeniably so, and it was playing with him, making its presence known in ways that mocked his every attempt at rational thought. The mirror in the hallway became another battleground. He had initially found comfort in his own reflection, a familiar face in an alien landscape. But then he started noticing things, fleeting distortions, a ripple across the glass that wasn't there. His reflection would sometimes appear too still, its eyes too wide, a faint malevolent twist to his own lips that vanished the moment he focused on it. He began to avoid looking directly into it, instead catching glimpses of himself in peripheral vision. One evening, after another series of unsettling occurrences, a stack of plates in the kitchen collapsing with a deafening crash, the sound of children's laughter echoing from the empty upper floor, Elias felt a profound weariness settle over him. He was exhausted, frayed at the edges of his being. He had spent the last hour meticulously checking every window latch, every door bolt. He felt a fleeting, dangerous sense of calm, a fragile peace born of sheer exhaustion. Perhaps, he thought, it's finally decided to leave me alone, at least for tonight. He was walking back to his study, passing the long, ornate hallway mirror when he glanced up. He meant only to cast a quick, dismissive glance, but something held his gaze. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't quite right. The face was his, undeniably so, but it was stretched, elongated, as if viewed through warped glass. The skin seemed paler, almost translucent, and the eyes were sunken, black pits devoid of light. A subtle, grotesque smile played on its lips, wider than his own, a predatory baring of teeth. And then, slowly, impossibly, the reflection moved. Not in sync with him, but independently. Its head tilted, a slow, deliberate motion, and one of its long, skeletal fingers, not his own fingers, he realized with a jolt of pure terror, slowly, deliberately tapped the surface of the mirror from within. The tap was soft, a delicate click against the glass, yet it resonated through Elias's entire being, a sound of impossible proximity and horrifying reality. His breath caught in his throat, a strangled sound of abject terror. He couldn't move, he couldn't scream. He simply stared, mesmerized by the monstrosity that wore his face, the distorted grin widening further, revealing teeth that were too long, too sharp. Then the reflection spoke. Its voice was a guttural whisper, a dry, papery sound that scraped against the inside of his skull, yet it seemed to emanate directly from his own throat, a chilling mimicry. "We've been waiting, Elias." The words were clear, articulated, and utterly devoid of warmth or humanity. Elias felt a cold, paralyzing dread seize him. This wasn't a trick of the light, or his mind, or old house settling. This was a direct communication, a declaration. The entity had spoken his name. It knew him. It had been waiting. With a primal scream that tore through the suffocating silence of Blackwood Manor, Elias staggered back, tearing his gaze from the mirror. He tripped over his own feet, falling heavily to the floor, his head hitting the polished wood with a dull thud. He lay there, gasping, shaking uncontrollably, his eyes wide and unfocused, fixed on the ceiling. He felt utterly exposed, utterly vulnerable. The air around him grew impossibly heavy, thick and cold, pressing down on him, suffocating him. He could hear it now, not just whispers, but a cacophony of soft, rustling sounds, like dry leaves being dragged across the floor, or dozens of bare feet shuffling just out of sight. The darkness in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, to solidify, to move. He could feel eyes on him, countless unseen eyes, pressing in from every shadow. The house was not merely observing him anymore, it was closing in. He scrambled to his feet, adrenaline coursing through his veins, but his legs felt like lead. He had to get out. He had to escape this monstrous place. He stumbled towards the grand bifurcated staircase, its steps disappearing into the inky blackness of the upper floors. His only thought was to flee, to find a door, any door that would lead him out of this living nightmare. But as he reached the foot of the stairs, a profound, crushing weight pressed down on his shoulders, an invisible force that brought him to his knees. He gasped, struggling to breathe, his vision blurring. From the darkness above, a chorus of voices, thin and reedy, yet imbued with an ancient malevolence, began to call his name. "Elias! Elias!" They were not coming from a single source, but from everywhere at once, echoing from the shadowed recesses of the upper landing, from behind the closed doors, from the very walls themselves. The voices were distorted, each one slightly different, some childlike, some ancient, some barely human, but all united in their chilling repetition of his name. It was a symphony of spectral accusation, a siren song of the damned. He clapped his hands over his ears, desperate to shut out the sound, but it resonated within his very bones. He was trapped, and the house, or whatever lurked within it, was no longer content to merely frighten him. It was ready to claim him. He looked up, his eyes straining against the encroaching darkness, and saw, or imagined he saw, a multitude of indistinct shapes begin to coalesce on the landing above, their forms wavering like smoke, their eyes, if they had any, fixed hungrily upon him. The silence, when the voices finally receded, was the most terrifying sound of all, pregnant with the promise of what was to come. Part 3. The chorus of voices, a chilling cacophony that had called his name from the oppressive darkness, receded as suddenly as it had erupted, leaving Elias prostrate at the foot of the grand staircase. The crushing weight on his shoulders eased, allowing him to gasp for air, but the terror remained, a cold, hard knot in his gut. His hands, still pressed against his ears, trembled, trying to quell the phantom echoes that reverberated within his skull. He scrambled backward, away from the staircase, away from the unseen presences he instinctively knew were still lurking in the shadows above. He crawled on hands and knees, ignoring the splinters and dust, until his back pressed against the cold, unforgiving wall of the main hall. His eyes darted frantically around, searching for an escape, a reprieve, anything that wasn't the suffocating, malevolent presence of Blackwood Manor.
The grand front door, his last hope, seemed impossibly far away, a beacon of sanity in a swirling vortex of madness. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the silence, sharper and more immediate than the whispers or the dragging. It was the distinct creak of the floorboards above him, slow and heavy, as if someone or something was descending the main staircase. Elias froze, his breath held captive in his lungs. He couldn't see anything in the gloom, but he could feel the shift in the air, a drop in temperature that was palpable, almost physical. The cold intensified, radiating from the staircase like an open wound. Creak, creak, creak. The sounds were deliberate, measured, descending one step at a time. Elias squeezed his eyes shut, wishing desperately for it to be a dream, a figment of his sleep-deprived imagination. But the cold, the scent of damp earth and something acrid, the undeniable presence, it was all too real. He risked a glance, peeking through slitted eyelids. The darkness at the top of the stairs was profound, but as his eyes adjusted, he thought he saw a deeper blackness within it, a shape coalescing, indistinct and wavering, yet undoubtedly present. It seemed to lean forward, as if peering down at him from the landing. A shiver, colder than any he had yet experienced, passed through him, chilling him to the very marrow of his bones. He knew, with an awful certainty, that whatever was descending was not human. He had to move. The primal instinct for self-preservation surged, overriding the paralyzing fear. With a desperate burst of adrenaline, Elias pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in his head from the fall. He stumbled towards the front door, his hands outstretched, blindly fumbling for the ornate brass handle. As his fingers closed around the cold metal, a thunderous crash erupted from the second floor, the sound of a heavy piece of furniture, perhaps the very wardrobe he had seen earlier, being violently thrown. The entire house vibrated with the impact, and a shower of plaster dust rained down from the ceiling. This was no mere haunting, it was an active assault. He twisted the handle, shoved against the heavy door. It groaned, resisting, as if held by an invisible force. He pushed again, harder, gritting his teeth, straining every muscle. It gave way with a sudden, protesting shriek of old hinges, revealing the stormy, rain-lashed night outside. Hope, a fragile, desperate thing, surged within him. But as he stepped across the threshold, the very air solidified, becoming a tangible wall of icy resistance. He was halfway out, one foot on the stone porch, when an invisible force slammed against his chest, throwing him backward into the dimly lit hall. He landed hard on the polished floorboards, the wind knocked out of him, his head striking the wood again with a sickening crack. Darkness swam at the edges of his vision. He lay there, gasping, disoriented, staring up at the grand vaulted ceiling. The front door, which he had so desperately fought to open, now stood completely, irrevocably shut. No, not just shut. The heavy iron bolts, which he knew to be broken and rusted, were now visibly slid into place, gleaming darkly in the faint light. He could hear the faint, sickening click of the deadbolt engaging. He was sealed in. A low, guttural chuckle, dry and brittle like autumn leaves, echoed from somewhere near the staircase. It was not a sound of mirth, but of ancient, malevolent triumph. Elias pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest, his head swimming. He was trapped. The realization settled over him with the weight of a coffin lid. He stumbled blindly into the nearest room, which happened to be the drawing room he had tried to clear days ago. The dust sheets, which he had meticulously folded and stored, were now strewn across the room, several of them ripped to shreds, as if by frantic, unseen hands. The air was thick with dust, and a faint, sweet smell, like decay and lilies, permeated everything. He leaned against a covered armchair, his mind racing, desperately searching for an explanation, a solution. He had to fight back. He couldn't just surrender to this unseen terror. He needed light, a weapon, anything. His gaze fell upon the grand fireplace, its mantelpiece adorned with the antique curiosities. He remembered a heavy, ornate brass poker stored beside the hearth. With renewed purpose, he stumbled towards it, his eyes darting into every shadow. As he reached for the poker, his fingers brushing against the cold metal, a sudden, blinding flash of light erupted from the large, grime-caked window opposite him. It wasn't lightning from the storm. It was an internal light, a brilliant, searing white that momentarily bleached all color from the room.
And in that pure, agonizing brilliance, he saw it. Standing directly outside the window, pressed against the glass as if trying to peer in, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and twisted like the gnarled branches of the oaks outside. Its skin was the color of old parchment, drawn taut over a skeletal frame. But it was its face that froze Elias's blood. It was featureless, smooth and blank, save for two cavernous, obsidian eyes that seemed to absorb all light, and a gaping lipless mouth that stretched across its lower face, a silent scream of endless hunger. Its body was barely clothed in what looked like tattered, ancient grave shrouds, stained with something dark and viscous. It stood there, utterly still, watching him.
And then, slowly, agonizingly slowly, a single, elongated finger, tipped with a claw-like nail, rose and tapped against the window pane. Tap, tap, tap. The sound, though muffled by the glass, resonated with the same chilling familiarity as the mirror's touch. Elias didn't scream. He couldn't. His throat was locked, his lungs refusing to obey. His heart seemed to stop altogether. This was it, the face of his tormentor. Not a shadow, not a whisper, but a physical manifestation, standing right there, undeniable, horrifying. The intense light vanished as abruptly as it had appeared, plunging the room back into oppressive gloom. Elias was left staring at the window, the image of the creature burned into his retinas.
He knew, with a certainty that transcended fear, that the creature had not been a reflection or a trick of light. It had been outside, yet simultaneously aware of his every move, his every thought. He stumbled away from the window, his mind a fractured mosaic of terror. The poker forgotten, he could only retreat further into the house, a futile attempt to escape the inescapable. He found himself in the kitchen, a space that had once felt mundane, now imbued with a pervasive dread. The stack of fallen plates lay shattered on the floor, their sharp edges glinting malevolently in the dim light. He needed water, something to clear the metallic taste of fear from his mouth. He reached for the faucet, his hands shaking so violently he almost missed it. As the cold water rushed out, filling the quiet space with its mundane sound, he suddenly heard it again, the voices. But this time they were different. Not a chorus, not a whisper, but a single, clear, unnervingly childlike voice emanating from the pantry door directly behind him. "He's hiding, Mommy. Can we play with him now?" The voice was sweet, innocent, yet laced with an undertone of something ancient and predatory. It was the voice of a child, but not a child he could ever know. It was too old, too knowing. Elias spun around, dropping the glass of water, which shattered on the tiled floor. The pantry door, previously closed, now stood ajar, a sliver of inky blackness revealing nothing but deeper shadow. But the voice had been so clear, so close. "Mommy?" The word echoed in his mind, chilling him to the core. Who was Mommy, and who was he? He backed away, slowly, his eyes fixed on the sliver of darkness, expecting a small hand, a curious face to emerge, but nothing.
only the hungry darkness. Then, from the deep shadows of the pantry came another sound, a low, soft hum, a lullaby. It was tuneless, ancient, and utterly horrifying. It was being hummed by a woman, her voice deep and resonant, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the house. The lullaby wasn't comforting. It was a dirge, a mournful, possessive tune that promised eternal, suffocating embrace. The pantry door began to slowly, inexorably swing wider. Elias felt a cold, unseen hand brush against his ankle.
He gasped, kicking out instinctively, stumbling back against the kitchen counter. He was no longer alone in this house. He was surrounded. The child's voice, the lullaby, the thing at the window, they were all part of some horrifying, interconnected family. And he was their new toy, their new offering. The dark maw of the pantry yawned wider, revealing only deeper, more profound darkness within. But he could feel their presence pressing in, an invisible throng of watchers. And the lullaby continued, growing louder, more insistent, drawing him in, promising an end to his fear, an eternal, suffocating embrace. He was no longer just observed, he was pursued. And the hunt, he realized with a fresh wave of terror, had only just begun. The lullaby, a mournful, possessive hum from the gaping maw of the pantry, was the final shred of Elias's sanity unraveling. It was a sound that resonated not in his ears, but in the deepest, most ancient parts of his being. A siren song promising an end not to suffering, but to existence itself. He stumbled back, the shattered glass of his dropped water glinting like scattered teeth on the floor, his mind a maelstrom of terror and incomprehension. The child's voice, the lullaby, the spectral figure at the window. Blackwood Manor was not merely haunted, it was inhabited, a morbid family portrait waiting for its newest member. The pantry door, a portal to an unimaginable darkness, continued its slow, deliberate swing. Elias backed away until his shoulders met the cold, hard surface of the kitchen counter. His breath hitched in his throat, a raw, ragged sound. He could feel the oppressive weight of unseen eyes on him, not just from the pantry, but from every shadow, every crack in the ancient plaster. The air grew impossibly heavy, tasting of dust, decay, and something else, a faint, sweet, cloying aroma that reminded him sickeningly of lilies and formaldehyde. He couldn't stay in the kitchen. The open pantry was a gaping maw, and the hum of the lullaby was growing louder, more insistent, pulling at the very fabric of his will. He spun, his eyes frantically scanning the room for an escape. The back door, leading to a small, overgrown courtyard, was his only hope. He lunged for it, his fingers fumbling with the latch, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The latch clicked, but the door remained stubbornly shut. He pushed, pulled, twisted, but it was sealed as if by an invisible weld. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. He was trapped, utterly, irrevocably trapped within the cold, grasping embrace of Blackwood Manor. Behind him, the lullaby swelled, and the pantry door finally swung fully open, revealing not a darkened storage space, but a swirling vortex of inky blackness. From within that void, a shadow detached itself, wavering like smoke, yet unmistakably taking on a vaguely humanoid form. It was tall, slender, its movements fluid and unnaturally graceful. It didn't walk. It seemed to glide, its feet never quite touching the ground. Elias let out a strangled cry, his voice raw with fear. He pressed himself against the counter, his eyes fixed on the approaching entity. It was indistinct, a manifestation of pure shadow, yet he could feel its cold, malevolent gaze upon him. It reached out a hand, a long, attenuated limb that seemed to stretch and distort in the dim light, its fingers ending in razor-sharp points. It was coming for him.
He had to fight. He had to. His gaze darted wildly, landing on a heavy cast-iron frying pan hanging on a hook above the stove. With a desperate lunge, he snatched it down, its weight surprisingly comforting in his trembling hand. He swung it wildly, a desperate, pathetic attempt to ward off the encroaching darkness. The shadow figure paused, tilting its head as if amused by his futile gesture. The lullaby from the pantry intensified, and then, from the kitchen sink, a new sound erupted. The water faucet, which he had left running, suddenly blasted cold water, not into the basin, but directly at Elias, a powerful, icy jet that soaked him instantly. He yelped, stumbling back, the frying pan clattering to the floor. As he struggled to regain his footing, the shadow figure advanced again, its dark form seeming to expand, to fill the entire kitchen. The air grew impossibly frigid, and a chorus of whispers, distinct now, rose from the floor, from the ceiling, from the very walls. "Hours, hours, hours!" Elias screamed, a guttural sound of pure terror and desperation. He stumbled backward, away from the shadow, away from the rising cold, away from the voices. He burst out of the kitchen and into the main hall, his mind a fractured mess of fear and adrenaline. He had to get upstairs. He didn't know why, but a desperate, primal instinct told him that the upper floors, with their closed doors and winding corridors, offered some semblance of escape, even if only temporarily. He scrambled towards the grand staircase, ignoring the dread that had paralyzed him there earlier. As he reached the first step, a sudden, blinding flash of light exploded at the top of the stairs. Not the internal, sterile white light from before, but a swirling, chaotic vortex of sickly green and purples, accompanied by a sound like 1,000 angry wasps. In the heart of that maelstrom, he saw them. Dozens of faces, gaunt, pale, their eyes burning with a cold, predatory light. Some were childlike, their features twisted into grotesque grins. Others were ancient, their skin like dried leather, their mouths open in silent, hungry screams. They were translucent, shimmering, yet undeniably real, pressing against each other, jostling for position, all staring down at him with an insatiable hunger. They were the residents of Blackwood Manor, the ones who had been calling his name, the ones who had been waiting. Elias let out another scream, a thin, reedy sound that was swallowed by the house. He turned to flee, but as he did, the air behind him solidified. He found himself pressed against an invisible wall, utterly immobilized. He struggled, his muscles straining, but he couldn't move, couldn't even turn his head. He was trapped, caught between the terrifying throng on the staircase and the unseen force behind him. The sickly green and purple light pulsed, casting grotesque, dancing shadows on the walls. The faces above him began to descend, slowly, inexorably, their forms flickering like dying flames. He could feel their cold presence, an icy breath that carried the scent of graveyard soil and ancient decay. As they drew closer, their individual whispers coalesced into a single deafening roar, a sound that vibrated through his very bones, threatening to shatter him from the inside out. "Join us, Elias! Join your family!" The roar was not merely sound, it was a psychic assault, a direct invasion of his mind. Images flashed before his eyes, a spectral hand reaching for him, a cold, empty bed, a vast, eternal darkness. He was being pulled, irrevocably, towards the swirling vortex of faces. He fought with every fiber of his being, a desperate, primal struggle against an enemy he could not see, could not touch. He thrashed, he screamed, he pleaded. But his voice was lost, a tiny squeak in the overwhelming chorus of spectral voices.
Just as the first of the spectral forms reached the bottom step, its translucent hand reaching for his face, another sound ripped through the manor, piercing the spectral roar. It was the sharp, metallic clang of the old grandfather clock in the main hall, striking the hour. Dong, dong, dong. Each chime resonated with an unexpected power, a jarring physical impact that seemed to momentarily falter the spectral assault. The green and purple light flickered, the faces on the staircase wavered, and the pressure on Elias's body lessened just enough for him to gasp. He looked around frantically, his eyes wide with a desperate new hope. The clock! Its ancient mechanism, its familiar grounding sound, seemed to have momentarily disrupted the entities. He had to reach it, had to use its momentary power. With a surge of adrenaline, he twisted, managed to free himself from the unseen grasp, and stumbled towards the grandfather clock, which stood against the far wall of the hall. The spectral faces on the stairs hissed, their forms solidifying slightly, their hunger intensifying. The lullaby from the kitchen, momentarily forgotten, began to hum again, fainter, but still a persistent thread of dread. He reached the clock, its dark polished wood cool beneath his trembling hand. He noticed for the first time an intricately carved panel on its side, a small, almost hidden door. He'd never noticed it before. Driven by instinct, he fumbled with it, his fingers scraping against the aged wood. It sprang open with a faint click, revealing not clockwork, but a small velvet-lined compartment. Inside, nestled on a cushion of faded crimson velvet, lay a single tarnished silver locket. It was old, intricately engraved with swirling, arcane symbols that seemed to hum with a faint residual energy. Elias stared at it, his mind reeling. What was this? Why was it hidden here? As he reached for it, a sudden, powerful tremor shook the entire manor. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and the house groaned, a deep, resonant sound that was almost a growl. The spectral forms on the staircase roared again, their hunger returning with renewed vengeance. They were adapting. He snatched the locket, its cold metal surprisingly heavy in his palm. As his fingers closed around it, a jolt like static electricity passed through him. The symbols on the locket seemed to glow faintly, pulsing with a pale, ethereal light. At that moment, the spectral throng on the staircase lunged forward, no longer hesitant. Their forms solidified, their skeletal hands reaching for them, their faces twisted into masks of pure, unadulterated malice. The air was filled with the stench of death and the roar of 1,000 hungry voices. Elias had no time to think, no time to rationalize. He simply reacted. With a desperate primal scream, he thrust the glowing locket forward towards the oncoming terror. A blinding flash of pure white light erupted from the locket, searing into the very fabric of the house. It was not the sickly, chaotic light of the entities, but a fierce, cleansing brilliance that roared outwards, pushing back the encroaching shadows. The spectral forms on the staircase shrieked, a sound of agony and fury, their transparent bodies recoiling, dissolving like smoke in a gale. The green and purple vortex vanished, replaced by the mundane, dust-filled gloom. The pressure on Elias dissipated entirely. He gasped, falling to his knees, clutching the still glowing locket to his chest. The silence that followed was absolute, deeper than any he had ever experienced in Blackwood Manor. The clock had stopped chiming. The lullaby had ceased. The whispers were gone. He was alone.
Or so it seemed. He looked at the locket, its light fading now to a faint, steady glow. What power did this hold? Why had it been hidden? And what had he just banished? The entities were gone, but the feeling of profound malevolence still lingered, a suffocating residue in the air. He was safe for now. But the sheer silence, the sudden, complete absence of the terror, felt more unsettling than the chaos itself. It felt like the calm before a different kind of storm. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was not over. He had only bought himself time. And the locket, whatever its purpose, held a secret he was now bound to uncover.
The locket, clutched in Elias's trembling hand, pulsed with a final fading glow, then settled into a dull, tarnished silver once more. The silence that descended upon Blackwood Manor was absolute, deeper and more profound than any he had experienced before. It was not the oppressive, watchful silence of a house merely awaiting its moment, but the sterile, hollow silence of a vacuum. The lingering stench of decay and the acrid tang of spectral energy dissipated, leaving only the ancient dust and the faint scent of rain. He lay on the cold floor, gasping, the adrenaline slowly draining from his limbs, leaving him weak and shivering. His head throbbed where it had struck the wood, and his body ached with the memory of invisible hands. He pushed himself onto his hands and knees, then slowly, shakily, to his feet. The grand staircase, moments ago a terrifying portal to the spectral throng, now stood empty, its dark wood gleaming innocently in the dim light filtering through the grimy windows. The grandfather clock, its chimes having provided an unexpected reprieve, was silent, its hands frozen at the moment of his salvation. He stared at the locket in his hand. It was undeniably old, its silver darkened with age, and the intricate, swirling symbols etched into its surface seemed to hum with a faint residual energy. He tried to open it, his fingers fumbling with the tiny clasp. It resisted, then clicked open with a soft metallic whisper. Inside, nestled beneath a tarnished circular glass, was a miniature portrait. It was old, faded, painted with a delicate, almost ethereal quality. It depicted a woman, her face framed by dark, cascading curls, her eyes a startling shade of green. She possessed a delicate beauty, yet there was an unsettling stillness to her gaze, a profound sadness that seemed to stretch across centuries. She wore a simple, high-necked gown, and around her own neck a silver chain, from which hung a locket identical to the one Elias now held. Elias stared at the portrait, a profound sense of recognition, of belonging washing over him. It was a face he felt he knew, though he had never seen it before. The woman's eyes, even in the faded paint, seemed to draw him in, holding a secret, a profound sorrow. He knew, instinctively, that this woman was connected to the house, to the entities, and perhaps to himself. He turned, his gaze sweeping across the silent, dust-laden hall. The library. It was the only place that might hold answers. He moved with a renewed, desperate purpose, the locket clutched in his hand. The silence of the house no longer felt empty. It felt pregnant with unspoken stories, with the weight of generations. He pushed open the heavy library doors, the familiar scent of aged paper and leather, a sudden comfort in the chaos of his mind. He went directly to the section of the library he had been exploring before the terror truly began, the local histories, the obscure family genealogies. His fingers, guided by an unseen urgency, pulled out a thick, leather-bound volume he hadn't noticed before, its title simply Blackwood Family Annals. He carried it to the grand reading table, switching on a single dim lamp. The locket lay beside him, its silver gleaming faintly. He opened the book, its brittle pages crackling like dry leaves. The annals detailed the lineage of the Blackwood family, the original builders and occupants of the manor, stretching back generations. He skimmed through, his heart quickening as he saw familiar names, dates that coincided with the manor's construction.
Then he found her, a detailed entry accompanied by a small charcoal sketch that undeniably matched the locket's portrait. Eleanor Blackwood, born 1788, died 1812.
Beloved wife of Arthur Blackwood, mother of 3, a woman of ethereal beauty and profound melancholia, accused of witchcraft and infanticide following the sudden, unexplained deaths of her children and the strange, chilling occurrences that began to plague Blackwood Manor. Hanged by torchlight in the manor's courtyard, her body then interred in the family crypt beneath the house along with her children. Legend states her spirit and those of her lost children lingered, bound to the stones of the manor by grief and injustice, forever seeking peace or vengeance. Elias's breath hitched. Eleanor, the mother, the children, the whispers, the lullaby, the dragging. It all coalesced into a horrifying, tragic narrative. The spectral family.
They weren't just malevolent entities, they were lost souls, victims of a brutal, superstitious age, trapped by their anguish and their violent end. He continued reading, his eyes devouring the faded script. A passage near the end of Eleanor's entry caught his attention, written in a different, frantic hand, perhaps a later entry by a distraught relative. The locket, her sacred charm, she swore it would protect them, bind them to her even beyond the grave. Her final words before the rope took her were of the locket and of her kin. "He will return," she cried, "to finish what was started. The blood calls for its own." We searched, but the locket was never found, lost with her in the terror. Elias looked down at the locket in his hand. "He will return. The blood calls for its own." A cold, sickening realization began to dawn on him. His own surname was Thorne, but his mother's maiden name, it was Blackwood. A distant branch, yes, but a branch nonetheless. He was kin. The inheritance wasn't random, it was a summons. He was the he Eleanor had spoken of, the one destined to return. As this horrifying truth settled into his bones, a new sound, faint but distinct, reached him from the depths of the manor. Not whispers, not footsteps, but a low, mournful wail. It was a sound of profound grief, a lament that seemed to emanate from the very stone and timber of the house, growing slowly, inexorably louder. It was Eleanor, and she was calling him. He looked back at the portrait, the sad green eyes of the painted woman seeming to gaze directly into his own. He felt a deep ancestral pull, a profound empathy for her suffering, intertwined with a chilling dread for his own fate. The locket, which had momentarily repelled the spirits, now felt like a conduit, a binding agent. It had not banished them, it had merely quieted them, awaiting his understanding. The wail intensified, a sound of heart-wrenching sorrow, and with it, the pervasive cold returned, seeping into the library. Elias felt the familiar prickling sensation on his skin, the sense of unseen presences closing in, but this time there was no malice, no hunger, only a boundless, suffocating grief. He stood up, clutching the locket, his eyes fixed on the portrait of Eleanor. He understood now. They weren't trying to scare him away. They were trying to bring him home, to join them, to complete their family. As the wail reached a crescendo, a new image flickered into his mind, clear and sharp. A vision of a desolate courtyard, a gnarled oak, a figure dangling, and 3 small, pale forms beneath it. Then the blackness of the crypt, the bodies of the children buried alongside their mother, restless and lonely. The lullaby, soft and ancient, began to hum again, not from the pantry this time, but from the depths of his own mind, a spectral echo of Eleanor's eternal comfort. "He's here, Mommy," a tiny, innocent voice whispered, also from within his thoughts. "Elias is here." The locket in his hand grew warm, then hot, a burning brand against his palm. The images, the sounds, the emotions flooded him, overwhelming his senses. He was no longer Elias Thorne, scholar, rationalist. He was a piece of Blackwood Manor, a descendant, an inheritor not just of property, but of a terrible legacy. He slowly walked towards the main hall, drawn by an irresistible force. The wails and the lullaby intensified, guiding him, pulling him. He knew where he had to go, to the crypt, to his family. As he reached the foot of the grand staircase, the air thickened, becoming almost viscous. He could see them now, not as terrifying specters, but as translucent, shimmering figures, coalescing around the base of the stairs. Eleanor, her form still shrouded in sorrow, her green eyes fixed on him, her hand outstretched. And beside her, 3 smaller figures, pale and childlike, their faces now filled not with grotesque grins, but with a heartbreaking longing. They reached for him, their transparent fingers brushing against the edges of his aura. They were not attacking. They were welcoming. Elias felt a profound, aching sadness blossom in his chest, mirroring their own. He was their missing piece, the blood relative destined to return, to finally be with them. The locket, burning in his hand, was the key to their reunion, to his absorption into their eternal, sorrowful embrace. He closed his eyes, accepting his fate. The house had not been trying to drive him out, it had been trying to bring him in. The terror had been a desperate form of communication, a frantic plea from lonely, tormented souls. When he opened his eyes again, the figures were no longer transparent. They were solid, vibrant, their faces filled with a joyous, if chilling, expectation. Eleanor smiled, a soft, ethereal light illuminating her features. The children giggled, their laughter echoing with an ancient, eerie mirth. Elias smiled back, a strange, hollow feeling in his chest. He took a step forward, then another, towards them, towards the crypt, towards his new, eternal family. The locket slipped from his hand, falling to the polished floor with a faint clink, its light extinguished. He felt a sudden sharp chill, not from the house, but from within himself, spreading outwards. His vision blurred, the edges of the room dissolving into a swirling gray. He looked down at his hands, watching in detached horror as they began to fade, to become translucent like smoke. His body, his very being was dissolving, merging with the ethereal fabric of Blackwood Manor. The last thing he saw, before his vision completely faded, was Eleanor's face, serene and beautiful, her green eyes full of a possessive, ancient love. She reached out, and her hand passed through his chest, a cold, comforting touch. He was home. The manor settled into a new, profound silence. The grandfather clock, still frozen, reflected the faint, gray light of dawn. The locket lay on the floor, tarnished and inert, a mere trinket. The spectral figures were gone. The wails, the whispers, the dragging sounds, all ceased. Blackwood Manor was finally at peace. For now. But sometimes, on the longest, darkest nights, if you listened closely, a faint, melancholic lullaby could be heard echoing from its depths. And sometimes, a new shadow, taller and more substantial than the others, would slide across the corner of the room, its presence heavy with a quiet, waiting anticipation. For the blood calls for its own. And Elias Thorne, the scholar, had finally joined his family. He was just another part of the silence now, waiting for the next one to arrive. And if you're reading this, if you feel a sudden, inexplicable chill, a fleeting impression of eyes on your back, then perhaps you are next.